Minasan konnichiwa. Watamondo wa kayobi no gozen 10時なので、.NET API Review no 時間です。はい。That is my attempt at Japanese. All right. Yay, we're back to normal. We have some red issues, and eventually someone with a camera on will show up, and you guys will have a face to look at other than mine. But
Before we start, Jeremy, how many languages do you have a passing ability in?
do I have a personal passing ability in? I can talk my way functionally through Spanish, though I probably sound like a 4-year-old. And according to the German friends, well, now Swiss friends we were staying with in Switzerland, if I stayed in Switzerland about a month, I would sound like I really knew German. So I can talk my way through German too. There was a brilliant time in Switzerland when I didn't feel like speaking German, and I walked into a store or a restaurant to buy food. It was actually a McDonald's. And I asked if the person spoke English, and she's like, sorry, no. And then it was like, fine, I'm going to get through this. I am tired. I just want some coffee and a croissant. And I think she told me there was a sale if I got a smaller coffee. But darn it, I wanted a bigger coffee, and I got what I wanted. So, so
Excellent.
3. Um, but Japanese, I work on the pronunciation. I can recognize most of the words in my. I will admit, today was a script. So
Got it.
I also functionally got through France. Spanish. My knowledge of Spanish was enough to sound like a 3-year-old in France. So, bonjour. All right. With that fun sidebar. All right. First up, assuming this is the right order. Yep. Add invoker classes for fast invoke APIs 85539. Mr. Harder.
Sure. Are you going to share the screen?
Yes. I thought I missed a step. The internet can see it. Why can't the rest of you?
Okay. Looks good now. Okay. This functionality is for performance, and we decided that having these separate APIs for certain areas, including dependency injection, is kind of critical for us to move away from using IL emit and expressions, link expressions. These APIs, because they do validation differently and they can generate different IL, are up to 2 times faster, and that will move the bar pretty far for getting rid of link and IL emit. These APIs are not on method info for performance reasons. It avoids a virtual call and then kind of a redirect back to these invoker classes. These invoker classes already exist, but they're internal. These methods don't exist, however. Different methods are internally there today, but not public. So I can walk through it. It's fairly simple API. You ask for one of these invokers, either constructor or method invoker, and there's 2 sets of methods to call. One that takes a span, and then one that you can specify each parameter explicitly, up to 4. I'll just stop and wait for feedback.
Why would this take a
So-
writable span?
Or that broke up.
What? Why would you take a writable span instead of a read-only span?
Oh, okay. Yeah, good question. The writable span supports copyback functionality. So if you have a ref or out parameter, you'll get that. We did think about adding just a version for read-only span, because that's kind of what the other ones, they spell the individual parameters are for. But then we thought eventually people would want the writable back. So I guess the answer is we can add the read-only one if we want, but we decided to add the writable one for now. So this is how reflection works today. You call it method-based invoke, and you pass it an array. And if you have ref or out parameters, they are copied back into that array, and the same behavior is appropriate for span here.
So this is all object-based because this is still the scenario where you're dynamically bound and you don't know the signature.
Right. Yeah.
And so you'd still use, if you cared about absolute throughput, you'd still use reflection emit to emit an API that was strongly typed to the discovered types of the constructor.
If you don't already have to box, then the answer would be yes. If you have to box, like dependency injection, and even like in system text JSON, for example, once you exceed on a constructor anyway 4 parameters, they fall back to object. So yeah, if you know the types, you would still probably want to use a mid. This will probably get you halfway there. It's twice as fast existing ones, which are 3-4 times faster than they were last release, but it's still not going to be ever as fast as a version that doesn't box, and
So
a version that doesn't do validation.
So in our adding these, are we going to be able to, in .NET 8, remove the custom paths used by some of our higher level libraries?
That's the goal. Yes. This I do link at the very top to a different issue that does talk about the strongly typed model, and we decided to peel off this and do this now because there's other work depending upon this here, and then do the other API, which won't require boxing after that. So
Okay.
we still plan on doing the other API, which will support ref structs or by ref like types, for the sender or return value or for parameters. But for now, we just need these.
I guess I'm just asking because this feels like a little bit of a middle ground, and I'm wondering if once we have that final thing, if anyone would still use this.
Yeah, so that's a good question, because originally we did want just this one other API that was ref based, and we have that fully functional prototype form. However, it does not, although it supports ref structs, which is cool, which you can't really do today. It's not as fast as this when you have boxing already and you don't know about the types, which is the case, like I mentioned, in for dependency injection, and also like even though we might not do anything in this release, that's true for system text JSON as well for calling constructors more than 4 parameters. So you probably wouldn't use that other API because it's not going to be faster than this.
Okay, so just reinterpret or replaying back what I think I heard is, for the scenarios that can use this, we expect this to be the epitome of perf. And there's nothing that we plan to do that will be faster than this.
Correct. Yep. If you're already boxing, and especially for less than or equal to 4 parameters, this is super fast. And we don't plan to get any faster. This is really calling either for the AOT side or for the core CLR side, which uses emit. It's very, very direct mapping. It does minimum validation. It does the same validation we have today, minus one thing. And we don't expect another API that would be faster than this for object. Yeah, we wanted to avoid, hey, there's a new API, fast. Okay, here's another one, faster 2, faster 3. We don't want to do that. So this is going to be the final object-based fast invoke API, and we want to add other ones that are not based on object, which are based on by refs, like I mentioned earlier. But that's after this.
What's the benefit of the abstract base class?
It's just for an internal use. I suppose if somebody wanted to polymorphically pass one of these two types, they could. But since these are public classes, and there's code sharing going on between the two, that is for convenience mostly.
But you can't even if you pass it as the base, you still need to cast it to the derived because there's no virtual methods exposed on the base.
Right. You'd have
At
to
which
check
point,
the type.
at which point you could still just pass it as object.
That's true. Unfortunately, you can't have a public class with an internal base class.
If we wanted to share state between these two things, then as an implementation detail, could they both just have a struct state backing field that encapsulates all of that logic? That way, the common functionality doesn't leak out into this public API.
I mean, it's probably going to have a tiny bit of impact on perf, but yeah, I could evaluate that.
It seems like unnecessary ceremony having this useless base class from a public API perspective.
Right, and I think we said that if there is a need to add it in the future and move APIs down onto the base class, that would be a non-breaking change, correct? So we could, I believe that means we can start off with having no base class and then slide one in the future, and people should, in theory, still work.
I believe that's true.
Yeah, I mean, we do that about every 10th review.
The original proposal was actually to have one class just called method invoker, not have the constructor version, but the request was for optimal perf for AOT to have two, which essentially just avoids passing in an extra object parameter for the constructor version. So I mean, that's why we ended up with two, and like I said, for the non-AOT version, that extra passing that extra object parameter is not even really measurable. So that's why there's the code sharing going on. I mean, it's internal implementation. But yeah, I could attempt to remove that, and if it doesn't work, I mean, if there's notable perf impact, I could come back.
Just curious, how did you arrive at 4 for the number of arguments, for the max number of arguments?
It could be more. It's a safe limit right now. I mean, we could add more down the road. Eventually, it just becomes kind of cumbersome to to do this. And the code sample that you see down below is something that we would do in the areas that use this when they're passed, when the size of the objects, and you can put a switch statement on. So eventually, there's probably there's a threshold somewhere. Now you can use the span version yourself and specify and have that backed by a class or a struct that can hold objects of any length you want, that avoids an elec, because really these parameters are spelled out this way because it avoids the elec that you need for the span. So you could actually implement these 4 parameters yourself manually.
Yeah, and I mean, with param span, which there's a reasonable chance is going to land in C# 12 and .NET 8, or with inline array, which already now exists for .NET 8 and which is likely getting a little bit of syntactic help from C# 12, it'll be relatively straightforward to do so. Certainly with params, if that lands. Part of what I'm wondering is if the and I don't have a strong care, but elsewhere where we take 1, 2, 3, etc. arguments, in general we've limited it at 3, and then we fall back to the array or span. I'm just wondering if there was a reason we've added the additional one with 4 here, like if we found it to be a reasonably common case.
No, the implementation of system text JSON uses 4. Implementation of func T and action T uses 16. I didn't know about the 3 in other areas, so it's an arbitrary limit right now.
Yeah, I mean, if we have a strong use for 4, then that's fine. It was mainly how did we decide it? This was my question. I think that my feedback would let's pick a number that is, ideally consistent with the rest of the framework, and then If there's a reason to go higher because our use cases for it are commonly using 4 or 5 or 6 or whatever, then great, let's add those two. But I do think either hopefully in C# 12, but definitely beyond, the span one will be fairly easy to use.
Yes, I would agree that we should promote a param span overload if we can. That said, like, this pattern is the same pattern we use on things like index of, so I don't necessarily have a strong aversion to it.
Oh, right. It just, but like an index of and string format and all those, we take up to 3.
Sure.
Yeah, but I mean, if we already have system text JSON, we know we'd call it with 4, then 4 already seems valid or verified.
Okay, so just to clarify, in system text JSON, they go up to 4 with no boxing, and then after 4, then they would call this one. So they would call the span version. Sorry.
What do you mean
so
up to 4 with no boxing?
System text JSON, when a constructor needs to be invoked during deserialize, it has some its own IL emit logic that avoids boxing for up to 4 constructor parameters, and then after that it falls back to object because it's too cumbersome. So I'm saying that system text JSON would use the span version after 4 and wouldn't use the bottom 4. I just pointed out that they had a limit of 4.
But is it going to use this at all? Because if it currently has a solution that avoids boxing, is it going to switch to one that requires boxing?
The solution for systems text JSON avoids boxing only for up to 4 constructor parameters, and then it falls back to standard invoke. So after 4, it would call the span version.
But before 4, is it going to still do its own reflection?
Yeah, it would to avoid boxing. Yeah. It would need that other API that's not being reviewed now to do that.
It's not going to actually use any of the object-based, like it would only use the span.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Do we have any known consumers of this API right now?
Dependency injection plans on using this right away.
Okay.
Dependency injection will use it on .NET 8 and it'll keep doing its own thing for down level.
Right. And right. In this in particular, it's a DI factory code.
That seems okay to me.
Right, so are we keeping 4, killing 4? Don't care.
I would suspect that if the JSON team had a scenario where they thought 4 was worth optimizing in their own code paths, then I suspect they have evidence that people would derive benefit from a 4 parameter overload.
Does the invokers, so do the invokers need to work in languages that are less good with using spans?
These APIs are all optional, right? I mean, they have no new functionality.
You can do all this today using the existing APIs. These are if you want to turn the dial up to 11 for perf.
Right. If you and that's one of the reasons too. We want to move them away from method base, because they are specialized for performance. There's likely to be additional methods added these classes after this, but it's not expected that you'll need to call them. I mean, you can use a standard method invoke.
Okay. And then
for what it's worth, sorry, something you just said made me realize. I think that's also another good reason to get rid of the base class is its name, because there is a thing called method base, right? And this is not a method base invoker. It is the base of the method invoker.
Okay. Yeah. Like I said, yeah, we can remove that, and I'll attempt code sharing or duplicate the code, I guess, if I have to.
Yeah, I I don't think you would need to duplicate it. I think you can refactor it into an internal struct and then just have a struct backing field for both of these. And the JIT should be able to optimize all of that pretty well. If not, we'll file a JIT bug.
Makes sense.
Yeah, so is it the done thing in the reflection APIs to call the target instance parameter obj instead of instance or target or at this, or like is obj and arg the right pair of parameters for method invoker?
I think there's some inconsistency here. I mean, sometimes I believe it's called obj. Sometimes, in some cases, it's called target. Is that your question, Jeremy? Just OBJ?
Right. Like, is OBJ the right name for this? If there was no existing reflection, then the answer would be no. But if there is existing, or if it's consistent with the rest of reflection, then sure.
Yeah, the existing method-based invoke does use OBJ. However, they call the parameters instead of arguments, and we call them arguments in other places. So yeah, I should have maybe discussed this a little bit, but
and the docs for that calls parameters and argument list, so the parameter name and its documentation aren't consistent.
Another question related to naming is, I know in some places we have zero-based naming for args, arg0, arg1, arg2. We should be consistent with whatever's closest to these APIs. So if elsewhere in reflection we also take multiple arguments and they're zero-based, we should be zero-based here. If they're one-based, we should be one-based here. Yeah, like string.format, for example, has arg0, arg1, arg2.
Yeah, I was looking at function action, I guess, and it makes sense to talk about the first argument and the second argument and not an index in this case. So I prefer the one base, but I'll double check to make sure reflection doesn't use zero based arg parameters. I don't think there's any APIs like that.
So you're looking at the type parameters for func that start at 1?
Yeah, it's like arg1, arg2, t1, t2.
Oh yeah, I see it in the actual delegated definition.
Yeah. One complication here is that this isn't really exposed through the reflection API surface, but people who are familiar with reflection tend to interpret arg0 as the special this parameter, as opposed to something explicitly passed in an arguments list. So I don't know how strong an argument that would all be, but given the audience that this targets, maybe that's worth considering.
It's fine, as long as we're consistent with the rest of reflection. So if Steve can just double check what's done elsewhere.
Yeah, I think this is consistent, but I'll double check, and if we have zero elsewhere in reflection, I'll come back and open this up for review again.
And method invoker, so the reason the obj parameter is nullable is to invoke static methods, right?
Right.
Okay. Will this be able to invoke instance methods with a null this, or are you blocking that?
I'm not sure what happens today in implementation.
I guess just you're intending to be at parity in terms of behavior with the existing reflection stack, right? So I guess you'll just use whatever that is as a baseline.
Right. Yeah. It basically calls the same validation routine, with the exception of the type.missing behavior, which has an impact on performance and isn't needed in at least in the DI case, or so that would require, if you pass in type.missing, which is basically a way to tell reflection to use the default value, if that parameter has a default value, that affects measurable perf, and it's easy to work around.
Just totally out of curiosity, but reflection today also special cases DB null, right? Will these special case DB null?
I don't remember seeing any DB null behavior. What is that? Does it map to null?
I honestly don't remember. I just remember when I've looked at it in the past, I know DB null was in there. I've never cared.
No,
I
I
was just
don't
curious
recall
since you
seeing
called
that,
out type
no.
dot missing. I was wondering.
Yeah, I mean,
Although
basically
actually,
everything
I'd have to go check it. The DB null thing might only kick in if you're doing type dot missing. So it's possible it's one and the same.
all of the validation code and then defaulting, or sorry, all of the validation code. Well, I guess defaulting too. If you is this exact same except for type dot missing. So this means, for example, if you pass a null for a value type, we get the default value of that value type. Or if you pass in a pointer, system.pointer, we'll convert it to int pointer, that sort of thing. Enums and pointers are special, and all of that logic is the same here.
Sure. Seems fine.
Okay.
Alright, so I think the only change was to get rid of the base class, and then I removed all the comments and reordered things. I changed the internal constructors to private. If they're internal, it doesn't matter. Just what would show up in the ref assembly, I believe, is private. And yeah, we asked about obj, we asked why this is span instead of read-only span, and we talked about the indexing on this. Have I missed anything?
We also talked about the number of arguments.
Fair enough.
I guess something that didn't come up is we're using static factories instead of constructors. That's intentional, just in case you need to return a subclass type in the future. Is that...
The thinking there is that there might be some caching going on. I think it's just safer to use the factory here.
You mean the implementation might cache a constructor invoker for a given constructor info, for example?
Yeah, so for example, if you call the factory method and we detect that we've already created one, maybe for the standard invoke, because it can actually, I don't mention in here, but the standard invoke can end up using some of these APIs internally, and we expect, I don't know, 20% plus or minus improvement on the existing APIs. But in either case, depending on if that is created, we could just pick that up, for example. I'm not sure if we're going to do that right off the bat, but we decided also the user should maintain lifetime management for this. So that's another reason why we didn't call it like a Git, for example. We wanted the user to cache it. In the case of like system text JSON and DI, they do cache it just the way that they'd cache method base. Yeah.
Okay. Cool.
So yeah, today the existing reflection uses the invoker class. So if it's already created, we could probably just grab that in the create.
All right. Sounds like we're done. All right, that bug. Thanks, Steve.
Okay, thank you.
All right, define parameter marshalling of interfaces, 85797. It's a Jeremy issue, so approved?
Thanks. But actually, so as we've been working on the interface marshaller, we started using it on some internal libraries and noticed there was some features we needed to add that we kind of missed last time around. In particular, for the native marshalling attribute, which basically allows you to define default marshalling for parameters of that type in source, did not support being put on interfaces. So we want to add that so you can specify marshalling for your COM interfaces if you want to override the default. And then below, we also are providing a few different marshalers that provide the default behavior that you'd expect. And our plan is to integrate this with Marshal as support so that if the generator sees Marshal as unmanaged type interface, we would use the COM interface marshaler type. And I can go through each of the marshaler types and explain the differences with each of them. So the first one basically just uses the default, so it caches the COM wrappers instance privately, so you don't have to worry about where it lives. And it uses the default flags or the unwrapping flags, and when calling the COM wrappers methods to go to and from a native pointer to a managed wrapper or a managed object to a native wrapper, and handling the cases of unwrapping. The unique COM instance marshaler uses the unique interface or the unique instance flag when creating the object wrapper so that the user can have control of the lifetime of that runtime wrapper. And then the last case uses the same flags as the COM interface marshaler does, but it allows you to specify your own COM wrappers type instead of the strategy-based COM wrappers that uses the default strategies.
So I have a very maybe silly question here. Are these, is the T in these intended to be a COM interface?
Yes. T would be the type of the parameter, which would be the COM interface type.
Okay, yeah, just making sure, because I'm just working backward in my mind. These aren't supposed to support like arbitrary .NET types, correct? Where we are focusing just on COM at the moment.
So if you could also put like a type that has like the generated COM class attribute on it in here, and it would still work just because of the implementation, I think. Yeah, it would still work.
And we're talking COM classes, correct? Not COM structs.
Yeah, this is not records. This is not COM records or COM structs. This is just interfaces and I guess co-classes, because co-classes technically are just a collection of COM interfaces.
Okay, got it. Yeah, the reason I was asking is I was trying to figure out if there were any scenarios where you had to pass an address to a COM record in order to do some type of conversion while allowing COM to operate directly on the record in memory. And it sounds like that's kind of a non-scenario here.
Yeah, that is a different scenario. That would be if we ever get around to like doing variant support with custom records, and we are pushing that off until we have a user, because it's a lot of work, and we'd rather avoid that if we can.
Understood.
To maybe provide some why these three particular interfaces, like the primary goal here is to make COM source generators as drop-in replacement as possible. So the behavior really is, how does the built-in system work, and how can we make the source generator be as similar as possible? So there's no surprises here. That's why these three were chosen specifically to say, this is what people are going to want 99% of the time, and if you're someone else, do the work to write your own.
Yeah, the other nice thing is like these marshals would be very simple. So if someone needs to as Aaron said, write their own, at least for the basics of like, they just have to figure out where they want to put their com wrappers instance. And then they can just basically copy and paste our marshaller, and it'll work for com wrappers.
For
Perhaps
the
one other thing.
Go ahead, Aaron.
Well, perhaps one other thing to note, but I don't think anybody here is going to ask because I hope nobody cares. These are not intended to work with WinRT at all. There is no WinRT anything involved with this. So com wrappers does support it, but we are completely deferring all com wrappers, all WinRT scenarios to the CS WinRT Windows team to handle that. So those are non-goals for what we have proposed here.
Yeah, and just as an example, there's a first-party team that I was working with that's using a combination of our stuff and WinRT and things. It's very easy to write a custom marshaller to enable using a CS WinRT type in our system without having to do a ton of work. Like, if I'm going to be entirely honest, the whole thing was I got the whole thing to get generated by Copilot. Like, I typed out the attributes, I typed out the custom marshaller attributes, typed out the name of the class, and tabbed, and it was done.
So you're saying we don't need you anymore? We can just use Copilot now to do marshalling?
No, what I'm saying is we don't need to do extra work to make stuff go with WinRT. And Aaron and I will share it with you later. There's other interesting stuff for like future design relating to marshallers that we want to chat about.
All right, so for the middle proposed marshaller type, is this a domain-specific application of unique in this phrase? Because it seems more like unique instance com interface marshaller. Like, it's not anything about a unique interface. You're just saying this will guarantee-ish, I guess, that you're only creating one instance per T.
Yeah, that's what it is. It's basically we're saying we're going to pass the unique instance flag.
Okay, so there's a unique flag in com, and you're just saying that you're passing that. Oh,
yeah,
I guess up here.
For com wrappers. Com wrappers has a unique instance flag.
Right. So, do we want or need instance in the name, or do you think it's the like 12 people in the world who will need to use this will understand what it means?
Aaron, what do you think? You know the use cases for this more than I do.
I'm hoping the doc can have it. I have more of an aversion to long type names than I think the rest of the .NET community. So
I agree. It's at about the level of a good descriptive length, and getting longer does start to, like, I like descriptive type names, and that's already getting a bit iffy for me. So
we other than the fact that the enumeration is called unique instance, which we could debate if that was correct or not. We talk about unique com instances with people in this domain, so I think that should be pretty self-explanatory. It's going to be in the doc, so I hope that would be clear. Not against adding unique instance, though. I have no pushback.
Okay, since nobody else is saying anything, we can leave it as is. And then, do we, in general, have things that differ by just generic arity other than things like func? And in the specific case, do we think that the callers would understand when they would want of 1 T versus 2 Ts? Like, if you were looking for, I want my own com wrapper thing, would it occur to you that you want to just specify an extra T?
That's a great question. I put that up there just saying, hey, here's something that might be useful. I really don't know. I'm not even sure that Jeremy was all that interested in that second approach or not. So that is very much just me adding another option. Jeremy, do you have a strong opinion if that is warranted right now, or should they just write their own?
my only concern is I don't know how many people are going to be using custom subclasses of strategy-based comm wrappers, and like how many people that are currently using custom subclasses of comm wrappers would stay on that, but also move to using our system for some stuff, but not move their comm interfaces.
Never mind. You're right. Kill it.
Like it might be worth doing later, but we can also just like basically that's going to be a look at the comm interface marshaller, make a copy, and paste.
Reminds
we can
me of
always
a very
add it in the future.
C++ way of doing things.
Yeah, we were talking about this in our team discussion of trying to provide a better mechanism for customization here, but we were struggling on that, and our goal was to defer that until we need it, and hopefully we can avoid needing the most complex version of it for as long as possible. Yeah. So personally, I think the generic arity overloading was a good design for it. I just don't think we need the type.
Fair enough. Anybody have other feedback? Sold.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you. All right, GC refresh memory limit 70601.
So my turn. Hi, I'm Andrew. I'm proposing this new API. This is gc.refresh memory limit. You scroll down a little bit. This is the API. This is a static method on the GC called it refresh memory limit. It takes no parameters and it returns an integers. All it does is that it will go ask the garbage collector to reconfigure itself by detecting various memory limit on the system. So for example, you could have a container, you could change your container's limit, or you could specify things in the app context, like hip hard limit, that will ask the GC to reconfigure itself. So when you call it, it will reconfigure itself, and then it will return one of the following conditions. So either the refresh operation succeed, or it failed with various reasons. For now, there is only two possible things that can go wrong. One thing is you are specifying a memory limit that is too low, that you leave no room for the GC to move around, so we say no. Another possibility is when you set the app context data, you are setting it in an inappropriate way. So let's say you are setting things that is not a number, or you're setting a huge number, negative number, like whatever that don't make sense, then we say no, it doesn't work. Note that we also add the required preview feature attribute. For now, it's meant to be a preview feature only thing. We don't know if it worked yet. Trying to get people to try to use it.
How come we're returning an int rather than, say, having it be void and throwing an exception, or if this was a perf critical thing and returning an enum or something?
There is a footnote I wrote below. I'm expecting this API to be costed by people who host services which might use hosting API. The CRL hosting API do not allow the caller to catch exception, so it's much convenient to return integer status instead.
Okay, so why not an enum?
It would be the same. We can do enum as well.
I just want to make sure I understood. You expect that this is going to be called by native code via hosting APIs? Is that what I heard you say?
Yes.
Should this be a native API instead of a managed one?
We also got managed caller as well.
Yeah, I mean, so we could say we want to define the enum now, or we can say that let it go with an int, and before yanking the preview flag off, we change the int to an enum return.
Yep, that would work.
Is there, as new codes get added, are there ever going to be any new success codes introduced, or is 0 going to be the one and only success code ever?
Yep, you have only one way to success. This is success.
Okay.
There is no stupid S force.
I ask because like I've seen people get things like NT status and H result confused before. So if there is a pattern that we want to use, like we should just say the pattern is this, and it sounds like the pattern that you have is 0 is success and non-0 is failure.
Yes.
Okay. Cool. I don't have any other feedback on this.
So if we unpreview this without making any changes, would it still go through API review? Would we remember like, oh, we wanted to make this an enum?
That's a reasonable question. Given that I don't think that there would be a whole lot of callers, I don't think it would be the absolute end of the world if we never enum'd it, but it would not pass API review if it was proposed without the preview flag.
But the thing is, like, I know that we tend to defer to scenario-specific constraints when they crop up, and it seems like this has one.
Yeah, but what is the concern, Jeremy? Like, is it the lack of enum, or is it the return code versus exceptions?
Well, the return code versus exceptions was justified by needing or wanting a consistent thing from the hosting API and the managed API, which is fine.
Right.
But the moment that you say returns 0 when this happens, 1 when this happens, 2 when this happens, that's called an enum. We just didn't write it down as a type, and we should write it down as a type. But
yeah, the one thing I'll say is, like, I don't think we should have the bar in saying we accept APIs we don't like under preview, because the whole point of preview is that we say we do our best effort to have an API, but we might change our mind based on constraints, right? Or based on things we learn, right? But if we already know we don't like it, that means we just ask customers who will preview the API to change because we couldn't be bothered with designing it properly, right? So I would say if we strongly believe this should be an enum, we should just say needs work, please come back with the enum before we approve it. Like, I think it seems to me like bad idea to just punt work because there happens to be preview API, because somebody's going to pay for this down the road, right?
Fair enough. I guess I was assuming that one of the things that they're not sure about is if they've correctly described all of the errors that they want to be able to return in.
I mean, that one I can buy. I think, I mean, we have some APIs where we have interplay between managed APIs and hosting APIs. And at the hosting layer, it's an int, so a custom host can return whatever, in which case an enum might not work super well. But even in those cases, you could say, hey, there's an enum, there's like 6 well-known values that people should return, but anything else can also be returned, but then it's an enum, right? I mean, any int is a valid enum, basically, right? So you can, it just means you no longer have a named value at that point, right? So I don't know, it can be open-ended with well-known entries, I guess. Aaron?
Yeah, just out of curiosity, and maybe I missed this, so bear with me. Why not just, I hear all the talk about enums, why not, if this is primarily going to be used from a native context, and all of .NET in a native context return H results, why not just use an actual H result as the error codes? Like, if we're not throwing exceptions anyways, we've already accepted we're not throwing exceptions because this is called in a myriad of places. It's an int. Maybe we want an enum, okay, but if we already have a very rich way of explaining errors.
I mean, when you say we use H results, you're just talking about the values themselves, right? Because the type in managed land is going to be int. I don't think we have a type for H result in .NET.
Oh, yeah, absolutely agreed. You know, and so going that direction, the enum values would be H result values. But like, if we just use the concept of the H result where it's negative, so it's an error, and you know, whatever anybody, you know, everybody's feelings about S false, let's just make all error codes negative and be done with it. Like, treat it like any other .NET native API and just use the H result values.
That does at least solve any future versioning issues and puts it in a very easy to describe format for how to check success, how to check failure, etc.
Do we say H results are a thing even on Linux? Like, have we basically adopted that in .NET?
Yeah, the entire hosting API is, like, if you look at all the error codes returned, they're all H results. They're all ints and H results. The 32-bit return H results signed.
That was nice of us.
Did we decide absolutely no on the exception? Because like that has an H result property. But yeah, no proper type that I can find.
I mean, it could be that the managed one's void with the exception with the H result, and the native one is just the H result. But yeah, chat asks, do the callers actually even need the error, or do they just need to know success or failure?
From a caller's perspective, they really wanted to know two things. Is that success, or is that a retryable failure so that they can retry, or is it hopeless so they can stop retrying?
So in this case, error 2 of your settings make no sense is don't retry, and error 1 is you wanted me to be lower than the current memory usage, so I can't do it.
Most likely the user would probably retune their container so that it's bigger and try again.
Well, but that sounds like the thing you would do in both cases.
If you specify something just invalid as a number, then retry make no sense. You go figure out what's wrong. It's a programmer error.
It's basically I failed and threw an exception, except we're not throwing exceptions, versus I succeeded in setting the value, but it's technically too small to be used. So it's basically S false.
Not really, because I don't actually turn the limit off. So I just did the check and it is not sufficient. So we say we bail out. So it's like you are not doing anything wrong, but it is infeasible right now.
But are you treating that as an error case though?
Yes. Because it does not achieve what the user wants.
Does that mean that we're actually potentially missing an API? Because what does the user want then?
So what the user want would probably be, okay, I'm hosting a service right now. I'm spending something like, let's say 1 gig for the service. Now I know it's turning night and I wanted to resize my container so that it is smaller. So maybe I can try 128 gig. So I will try. And it called the API and it failed because right now you're already using, let's say 120 and the GC require maybe 30% more memory in order to operate. So it failed.
Well, what does it have a side effect even though it fails?
No, I make sure that. All I did is I do the check first, give an error, and then I do the changes.
Okay, so the failure codes basically leave the system in the same state as it was before.
Yes.
Okay. So yeah, it is properly failure then. Okay.
Okay, so what do we want to do?
So you had mentioned that there are native callers. Are native callers actually invoking this exact API, or is this mirroring an API that is exposed through a separate native surface?
Exactly this API.
Okay. I would be okay with leaving it as an int. Like, especially since we said there's a domain-specific restriction. Do we have an annotation that says callers like must observe the return value of this and do something with it?
No,
we have one that's been approved with an analyzer that Jeff Hanley has been iterating on.
Okay.
But it's stalled a little bit just because there are 2 other analyzers that are very similar in nature, and so he's trying to figure out how to rationalize the 3 of them.
I see.
Oh, I forgot we actually got around to proposing and approving that. In my head, it's just permanent pipe dream. Okay, so if this is that everybody just wants to say int is fine because we don't expect callers, and the callers we expect to read the docs, then
yep. And if we're following an NT status like system, 0 is the one and only success return value for all time. If we're following an H result system, then negative is error and non-negative is success. Someone more familiar with the hosting APIs can chime in. I think Aaron had already done that on whether like an NT status or an H result like return value is more appropriate.
Yeah, if it really is, this is intended to be called from a native context, I would follow the very good example that the hosting API has done and stick with H results. And, you know, we have, I think we have some of the infrastructure that if you add an H result into the tooling, it will generate you add an H result the low value, it will create a full H result error for you, and it's usable within the whole system. So I think continuing down that path is probably appropriate. It's also much easier to search for.
Sure. I guess the downside to that is like you are restricted to the H results that currently exist.
No, you can create a new one.
I guess you can. It's just like you would have to create your own facility for it, and things get a bit complicated at that point. Or am I overthinking this?
Not the facility is us. I think it's just a .NET facility. Like,
okay,
it's not really a big deal. I think the hosting layer has added a few of their own.
Okay.
We have 2 to the 16 error codes. We don't even come close to that many unique error codes. So adding 2 more isn't a big deal.
Sounds good.
All right, and is a sentence like that the right thing for requires preview features? Because this attribute is just the Boolean that you need to use the enable preview features, right? This isn't the experimental one. Looking for a response from you, Emo.
So I have multiple windows open. So what was the question? Is there anything missing there?
Requires preview feature. It wants a
Yeah.
string that's a sentence instead of a string that's like a feature flag, right?
That's correct. So there's basically there's an overload that doesn't take a message. I think in general what you want to do is set the URL instead, because then you can point to some doc page with more. But I think for simple APIs like that, I'm also okay with literally just having the attribute with nothing on it. I mean, right now the text doesn't say more than the attribute already.
Mm-hmm. I like that you call this a simple API, even though we've been debating it for like 20-ish minutes.
I mean, it's
yes.
simple.
It is.
I think it was less than the com one. I just want to call that out.
We have gotten through 3 in an hour, so
we're doing well.
All right. Approved. Argument exception helper methods 77749.
So this got open proposing 4 new throw helpers. I have, for now at least, boiled it down to just one to discuss now, and we can follow up on any others should we need to. We have, so the one here is throw if null or white space. We have previously discussed this, and we said, we're not sure if it's useful. Let's wait for more feedback. Since then, I think we've had 3 issues opened proposing throw if null or white space, including this one. And so I think it's time to just do it. It rounds out the story nicely. It's exactly the same as throw if null or empty, except it's using string.is null or white space rather than is null or empty. One interesting question is this was proposed where rather than returning void, it returns string, which is a fine thing if you want to use this in a more sort of, if you want to use this in an expression context and save yourself a line. The interesting thing is we don't have that on any of our other throw methods. We didn't do it for throw if null because we made that non-generic for inlining reasons, and that means that the thing that you're passing in is typed as object, and so we don't really want to return object. I think then we didn't do it for throw if null or empty, probably because we weren't really thinking about it. We have added a whole bunch of throw if greater than, throw if less than, etc. in this release. We could go back and augment those with return values if we wanted to, basically returning the input. So there's a general question of what do we want to do about the return position, if anything, or do we just want to keep doing void?
So I guess my first question would be like, if you're calling throw if null or white space, is the very first thing that you're going to do is to trim the result. So does that mean that we should return the trimmed value or the input value?
I don't know that it's true that you're going to trim the result. It's not if it doesn't contain white spaces, it's all white space.
I mean,
Yeah, I agree with that.
I can say in the last couple of weeks, every instance that I've seen of if string dot is null or white space throw, the thing that uses the string assumes it doesn't start with white space. It's like,
I don't think we would want to trim by default. I think we'd want to return the original input and let the caller do what the caller wants to do.
yeah, I mean, the only thing I can think of that you would want on that is string foo equal throw if null or white space bar, and it turns out that foo and bar are the same, so why would it need to return?
If you want to use, basically it's, you want to write one line or two, and that's literally that's it, right? Do you want to validate your argument and then use it, or do you want to be able to kind of validate it as part of your expression that's using it? I think that's the argument for why you return it.
Fluent-ish, fluent adjacent.
Yeah,
I
and
kind of
think
like it.
the general answer is we don't do fluent.
It's not fluent per se, and like
String builder.
The line of code that says return argument exception dot throw if null or white space input close paren dot trim is atrocious.
That's just like your opinion, man.
No, it says
No,
return
but-
argument exception. Like, argument exception is not involved in the thing you're doing. It was just where you stuck the validator. Like, I think we should be consistent with void.
Okay, the only point I'm making is like you can ignore it. It just gives you more options. Trying to steel man this. I personally like going back in for all the non-object APIs, returning, making it consistent, right, and returning the input.
I would prefer to leave it consistent with what's already there. That said, I know that like we've been kind of batting around the idea of having a compiler. Here's the particular API set that's visible to my compilation unit. So I wonder if maybe in the future that would allow something like overloading on return types or something, and then we would just be able to use this in the syntax that Stefan wants, just by introducing new overloads in the future, should that feature come online. One problem that I have with making it return something is that I suspect a lot of people have their own third-party tools that say, hey, this function returned a value. Like, why are you throwing it away?
Yeah, or even using the built-in analyzers that always require you to use the result. So I think we would end up seeing a lot of underscore equals throw if null or white space.
Yeah, I mean, not in ASP.NET apps, because that analyzer would be pretty heavy, right? But maybe in non-ASP.NET apps. I just, like I said, I'm trying to steel man it. I don't feel super strongly, but if I were king for a day, this gets through the string returns.
I'm looking to Tanner to help me out and say, like, we need to preserve RAX wherever we can.
RAX is assumed to be trashed by every method, no matter what.
Yeah.
But I also agree that this is an API called throw if null or white space. We are not returning values for any of our other throw APIs. We shouldn't be returning our value here. Just put it on the next line and call trim there.
Yep.
I'm fine with that. I just wanted to call out, like, I think we now have like 10 of these throw methods for argument exceptions, and like 8 of them were introduced in this release. So we could change those 8, and then we would have, the 2 outliers that don't return. We could also say, like, we're going to make this consistent with what we have, and we'd like to revisit before shipping .NET 8. I don't know if we would actually end up doing so, but
So
And
if,
to add
if
to that, oh, sorry.
if we're discussing changing everything to be consistent except for the 2, then I don't mind if it returns a value. There are several cases where that makes it easier to support various coding patterns, including switch patterns, where you can't currently make the default case throw unless it returns something. So
Right.
having the pattern where it does return is generally useful.
it's also
And
useful.
yeah.
Sorry, keep going.
I was just going to say, so if we were considering making everything consistent, then I'm fine. But as it is with everything not returning, I don't think we should make one exception here.
I was just going to add to Tanner's, it's also useful in the case where you need to delegate to base or another constructor.
Yeah.
All right, why don't we keep it like this because it's consistent with the other ones, but we should probably, I will open an issue separately to discuss whether we want to change the ones that we can change. We can't change the ones that we already shipped, but we could change the ones that we haven't yet shipped. There will be an inconsistency, but we can discuss that.
Do we need a RAWs char overload?
You wouldn't want null. It would just be throw with white space.
Right. I mean, I would probably call it throw if null or white space just to keep it in the same method group, even though null and empty are kind of the same on spans. But like, was there a request for a RAWs char overload even for throw if null or empty, or
I don't
has it just not come
remember
up?
seeing one.
Okay.
It's not to say there hasn't been. I just don't remember there being one.
Okay.
That said, it doesn't mean we couldn't add one.
I mean, if you haven't seen a use case for it, then maybe this isn't the right place to break into jail.
Yeah, I don't think we need throw if white space on Rust jar, and if someone has a case for it, they can propose it.
Yeah.
All right, revisiting the SHA-3 proposal, so 20342. So what we approved before has a whole bunch of unsupported OS platforms and unsupported OS platform guards. And during the review, we said, and we'll talk about this later. So I had a discussion with Emo in person using this weird thing called an office building. We were both in it at the same time, and this allowed us to have a communication face to face. It was weird. And
we both left it depressed, I think.
But then we both left it and went to a semi-morale event, which was fun. All right. So I suggested and think I convinced him, but need it to be discussed in this forum, that we should treat the crypto algorithms a bit more like we treat the intrinsics. And it's, if you're trying to use the primitive crypto algorithms, you just need to be smart enough to know that you need to call is supported. and we get rid of the guards because they're more encoding a point in time than a truth. Like, this isn't Win32 NTFS permissions don't make sense on Mac OS. This algorithm is not supported on on the known versions of Mac OS as of the time we shipped, which means that this is just a giant headache of encoding our current level of support. And yeah, so I think we should get rid of all of the attributes and then just say that there's a convention. If there's an unsupported, you should call it. Or Faith call it. Whatever works for you.
Well, we had approved an is supported API as part of the original thing, right?
Yeah, it has it.
Yeah.
But it has the
Oh, there it
guards.
is, yeah.
So if you call the is supported, then the OS analyzer won't tell you the thing you're doing might not work. Because this says if this returns true, then you're not on any of these OSs.
Yes.
Though that could be wrong.
Right.
Because it could return true
we'll
and you're on Mac OS, you're just on a newer version. Like, you built against 8, but you're running against 10, and by the time 10 comes out, Apple has added support and we've integrated with it.
And I'm also suspecting that at some point in the future, somebody important is going to ask for a polyfill. So, hooray. Compliance.
I will let you have that conversation with Niels, but I want a recording
Yes.
of it.
Yes.
And I will just play it every day when I'm sad and want to laugh at something.
Yes. I'll bake cookies and get on his good side. It'll be great. Okay, this seems fine to me. Nuke all the attributes, have an is supported, and follow the ISA pattern. Tanner, am I allowed to say ISA or is it ISA?
I always say ISA, but everyone can say it how they want, except for GIF. That's GIF. That's what the creator says.
He's wrong. It's a GIF.
Choose the API reviewers, choose TIFF.
Choose the API reviewers, choose Peter Pan. I honestly don't know
I
if I've
forgot
ever
about
had
that.
Peter Pan peanut butter. Okay. Right, so I will start doodling, removing all the attributes so I can. The top post contains the proposal without the attributes, and I was too stupid to notice it. Thank you, Kevin. I did a little bit of editorializing.
Jeremy Steffen just dropped an awesome GIF in the chat, in case you wanted to see it.
It's GIF.
It's after your own heart since you have a gavel.
Hey, look, it fits in finite space now.
Thank you for putting up with my bickering regarding that last time we reviewed it.
Oh, and then I don't know if Kevin included it in here. He did not. We put the OS attributes on ed 25519, which is why we put them on here. And for consistency, I think we should also remove them from ed 25519.
Yes.
So I want to go here and hit edit. solved. All right. Command line completions, I assume, is waiting to be scheduled. So, AES GCM decryption allows truncated tags 71366. Do you want to talk about this one, Levi, or should I?
I can talk about it, sure. So there is an interesting quirk of GCM where you can, when you've requested the algorithm generate or verify a tag, you can specify this is how long the tag should be. Normally it's 128 bits, but it could be pretty much arbitrarily shorter. And there are attack vectors in some cases where if a caller is not verifying that they're passing in a 128-bit tag, that the user has given them a 128-bit tag, maybe the user has only given them, say, an 8-bit tag, then they can coerce the caller into calling the verify method that's on this type. The decrypt and verify method is not shown on screen right now, but it does exist. And they would say, oh, I'm just going to give you byte 0, see if it decrypts and verifies. No, let me try byte 1. No, let me try byte 2, and so on. And it means that within 256 tries, they can get a valid, or they can trick you into decrypting the payload and validating it successfully, whereas normally it would have taken 2 to the 128 tries. So that is a misuse of the API. Generally, that would be a caller error, but like we do want to lead people into a pit of success rather than a pit of failure more generally. So the idea here is when you instantiate an AES GCM instance, at the time where you specify the key in the constructor, you also say, this is how long I require all tags to be. We expect that most people will pass 128 bits or 16 bytes, but they could make it whatever size is appropriate for their scenario. As Kevin points out in chat, we floor it at 12 bytes. You can't go lower than that. I believe some other implementations, not ours, actually let you go arbitrarily low. But yeah, this is basically a hygiene thing. It prevents misuse by callers. And we would obsolete the original API or the original constructors too, and say, hey, please call a constructor that specifies this.
And so the impact is that the encrypt and decrypt methods, which I'll pull up so we can look at them. APIs of...
Do people really want to look at them?
No, but we have to to show
Yeah.
where the weirdness is coming in. Here, let's be fancy and use the span ones. So if you passed a value in the constructor and tag.length is not equal to that value, it will throw. Where previously we were just accepting whatever tag size you gave in. In every sensible AEAD algorithm, the tag length is part of the formula, but in GCM, which is not a sensible AEAD algorithm, but is very popular, the tag length is not part of the formula, which is why it's subject to this abuse. So, from a design perspective, we got it right the first time, but from seeing how people use it in the wild, we've become convinced that we need to add the training wheels for them.
Yeah, I'm a little torn on this because it is a primitive, and I don't like putting training wheels on primitives because like it's a primitive. You should know how to use primitives if you're calling this API directly. But as Jeremy said, like we're seeing in practice that people are calling it incorrectly, and we have an opportunity to do a very slight tweak to the API surface and kind of get people out of that pit.
And anybody who wants the flexible thing that currently exists can just suppress the obsolete and keep doing the old thing. Yeah, so tag size in bytes is a nullable property because the existing constructors will put null there saying it's not being enforced, and otherwise it's there just because it was a constructor parameter, so why not?
So you wouldn't be able to do this kind of enforcement today, like using existing APIs via any means without like basically rewriting the class yourself.
So it's the expectation of the design of GCM is you're doing something like IPsec, and you have an IPsec frame, and the tag is going to be. I'll just assert that in IPsec it's 14 bytes. I don't think IPsec actually uses GCM. So that you know you're always getting 14 bytes. And if you didn't have 14 bytes here, your structure is broken. The problem comes in when you start getting things like JWT, where the tag is now just an extra parameter sitting on the side. The caller, according to the JWT spec, the person who receives it before validating it, or the validator itself, is supposed to say, wait a minute, this tag is supposed to have been 16 bytes, and then reject it. But we've seen that that's not necessarily what people at that level do. They just take the tag and pass it down to the lower level and assume that it's going to do something magical about the size. So
Yeah, people incorrectly putting crypto agility into their applications is why this is a problem.
Yeah.
Like ASP.NET calls this API in a few cases, but ASP.NET's calls are all safe because ASP.NET does not. ASP.NET uses smart crypto agility, not like hand wavy crypto agility, and as a result, like they do all the verification on their own. So we would just get a diagnostic code, obsolete it, obsolete as warning, I guess. And like Jeremy, like you said, if you really want to use this API, then obsolete or suppress that warning and move on with your life.
Yeah, so callers can do it right now before calling decrypt, say if tag.length not equal to what I expect, throw, and we're just going to move that to inside the call because we've seen they didn't do it.
So will like ASP.NET continue to use the obsolete constructors, or will it make sense for it to use these new constructors? Like, is it actually changing how? I mean, because we're just validating using this, right?
Yeah,
we're not encrypting.
Because ASP.NET's validating, you can call the new constructor and pass in a hard-coded 16 as the number.
Yeah,
it's not going to be a behavioral breaking change for ASP.NET.
Yeah, the only time anybody would see a break is if they use the same key and sometimes want to process it with one size tag and sometimes want to process it with another. And that violates best practices, but is not a thing that the spec itself says is nonsense. So.
Yeah. Question for this review board. For breaking change documents notifications, do we provide breaking change notices for obsoletions? I guess it is a source breaking change technically, so we would.
Yeah, generally.
Okay.
At least an ASP.NET.
Okay. I can go ahead and get that written up then, if this is approved. I'll also contact the CodeQL team and see if they have thoughts on this.
Yeah, we've also like talked about obsoleting, you know, giving at least one LTS release for people to react before deleting things. And in some cases, we've gone ahead and done that. But in this case, I think you're keeping it, right? That's kind of the point, is like you'd be fine if you never delete it.
Yeah, I don't see this ever being deleted because it is legitimate to call this. It's just make sure it's what you actually intended before you do it.
Alright, marked it breaking so it flags it for docs.
Cool, thanks.
This one's easy. I can speak to it. Basically, the networking folks have had multiple requests over the years for adding more strongly typed constants for media types, so systemnet mime media types, just so people don't have to write out the these strings themselves. So this is basically rounding it out with more media types.
Neat.
Do you know why RTF is proposed without a who cares about text RTF?
No idea.
Fair enough.
Yeah, and I assume somebody has gone through and just confirmed that these are all like hyphenated and so whatnot correctly.
Yeah, because it's certainly not the entirety of this list, so it's
No.
still being
Choosy.
yeah. I just yeah, because that's just associated with a dude, not with an RC. Yeah, just aside from questioning the arbitrariness, it seems fine to me. All Jason is problem Jason.
Does this only ship in .NET 8 or is this down level as well? I don't remember
.NET
where
8.
this type is located. .NET 8 only. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, many of these const names look weird, but it is what it is.
Mhm.
Zero overhead member access with suppressed visibility checks. 81741. Do we need yawn for this?
I can speak briefly to it if no one else on the call is. Looks like okay. In a nutshell, the idea is we want things like source generators to be able to call internal or private members on types. Right now, they're not necessarily able to do that, especially privates. They're not able to do that because they're outside of the type that declares that member. The idea here is that if you attribute your type member, whatever, in this specific fashion, it will, there's some magic between the compiler and the runtime such that they will generate a special, call it extern method that the source generator can then target, and that method will be filled in by the runtime in order basically to glue the source generator with the method that it was targeting, so that the source generator can, for instance, invoke a private constructor without having to use reflection to do it. It would basically be a reflection-free, full performance ability. I'm describing it at a very high level because I don't quite remember what happened in the latest iteration here, but that's the scenario.
How? Do you have an example? So this is just asserting that it's the return type that it applies
Yeah,
to?
the return type. The return type is used as an indicator for the type of object you're trying to create. But the idea is that line at the bottom, call private constructor, for instance, would be something that can be called by a source generator to say, I know that the source generator, because I'm existing in some separate hidden type somewhere, I don't have access to user data's constructor, but I can call this helper extern method that will basically, it is the equivalent of new obj. And now I can also call getName in order to party on its backing field directly, even though I don't have access to the backing field because everything goes through properties. That getName would instead return a ref to the backing field. So it's a way to kind of annotate at compile time the types of reflection that you're willing to allow, and because that gets baked into the DLL, the source generators, or whoever wants to call it, can rely on that functionality existing without lighting up the rest of the reflection stack and being basically full performance.
I guess I'm confused. Who's declaring these methods?
Oh, things like unsafe accessor, the extern static.
Is
I
that
believe
being in the generated code? Like, so the generator can write down,
Yes.
I'm going to call this private constructor and just bind it?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, the generator would put the extern static inside of its own code
Right.
behind, because it already has to have visibility into the type that you're creating. So like class user data, that's an internal class. The generator can see that class because it's part of the same project. It just can't instantiate it. So the generator would put that extern static along with that attribute to say, I need to be able to instantiate this. And now that's the factory method, which again, the implementation of the factory gets replaced by the runtime. And if the generator needs access to certain backing fields, then the generator also puts that extern static. Directly underneath your mouse cursor, or maybe that's mine. Oh no, that's a piece of dirt on my screen. There was a blurb that said the blurb that said that we're using the return type of the constructor to figure out what type you're actually intending to construct. To answer your question, most users will never see these attributes. Most users will never care about these attributes. It's for source generator authors.
Sure. For static methods, so for the static method, you need a parameter that then just you pass null to?
I believe so.
Okay. Because that's how the get field would work. You'd pass null to say you wanted it on the type.
Yes. And then the runtime implementation of the method, I believe, would discard it without looking at it.
Fair enough.
I guess because it doesn't light up the reflection stack, it's also AOT friendly.
And it says unsafe, so it very much acknowledges that you're doing something that may stop working when you get an updated version of the next library.
Mm-hmm. Well, the idea is that the library, because it's a source generator, is compiled into your application.
Yep.
So if, let's say that the compiler ever changes how they represent backing fields for auto properties, your source code, your generator would observe that anyway as part of the compilation unit. So because your generator is compiled along with the rest of the types it's accessing, then it should come together with no ability to break there.
If
but
you
unsafe,
recompiled.
If you assuming that the type is in the same assembly that the source generator has injected code into, then
if the type's
it would all work.
Right, but that's where I assume, because it shows the example here of like these are all together, but I assume that part of the intent of this is this type exists in the BCL, and the generator is like, oh, I was going to call activator.create instance and use reflection and set some fields on it, and we're done. And then the reason that this all gets weird is like the name of this backing field. If you changed it from an autoprop to a non-autoprop in servicing, this this unsafe reach through just got invalidated.
Yeah. I mean, don't do this with BCL types, please. But yes.
Right. Well, so that's where if the serializer is serializing into a type that is not controlled by the application, then it may see an update that invalidates it once it's reaching through to the field instead of reaching through to the property setter, which this had to because it wants the ref of the field. So, and I don't even want to know what happens if it grabs the ref to a field that's declared read-only. That's a runtime problem.
Yeah.
So it seems reasonable to me. As reasonable as it can get, probably.
I do wonder if this needs to be EBNever.
I'm fine with that, but
like, do we tend to put other EBNever stuff in compiler services? I know that methods like getPinnable reference tend to be EBNever, but those methods exist on types that we otherwise expose.
Well, I thought, if anything, that was just because it was just the pattern of fixed, and if we EBNevered it, it's because we thought it was just noise.
Oh, you know what it was? It was we EBNevered stuff like getPinnable reference because we intended for it to be targeted by the compiler itself. In this case, we intend these APIs to be targeted by, for instance, source code generator authors, so third parties. So yeah, we would not EBNever it then. And looking through the compiler services namespace, there's a bunch of weird esoteric stuff in there that is also not marked EBNever.
Yeah, so I would err on the side of not EBNevering because people running source generators might want to like test it and whatever.
Oh, you can test it. You just have to
know what to type.
If you knew to write unsafe accessor, then I think now IntelliSense would be like, oh, okay, I know what goes here. I don't know what would happen if it's like I know I need an unsafe accessor kind, but I was told not to show you that. I don't know how it resolves that dichotomy. But
the funny thing is with ChatGPT and stuff like it, like our choices for EBNever might matter less. If people actually write it, it's going to show up in the autocomplete, whether we EBNever it or not.
Yeah.
All right. So do we think unsafe accessor is the right word, or should it just be like unsafe access? Because you're not. I mean, I guess by definition, the method you're putting it on is an accessor. Well, aside from if it's a constructor. But well, it seems more you're describing the thing that this is about to do instead of this is an accessor and it's unsafe.
You are creating an accessor, basically. Like you're creating a public static or an internal static extern method that is an accessor.
It's fair. Aside from the one that's a constructor.
Sure. Constructors are always just kind of the odd ones out.
Mm-hmm.
For things like unsafe access or kind, I guess we just tend not to like nest those enums under their types because they might be used elsewhere.
Generally, it's don't use nested types because they're a pain to use, and there are a couple places we've used them, but that's when things are getting really, really esoteric and people aren't expected to need to really work with them. And in this case, it's a constructor parameter, so you would need to work with it. Plus, it's in compiler services, which is a bunch of don't look here unless you understand what you're doing.
Yeah. Okay. I don't have any other comments on this end. Oh, maybe we should seal the attribute class, unsafe access or attribute.
Yep.
I think we tend to do that anyway.
So if you wanted to use this to call a private property, would you just be using the method get underscore or whatever? Or set underscore?
I believe so, yes. The general scenario though is for rehydrating and populating objects, so generally it would be constructors and fields, but sure. You can see methods on there too, so.
Well, I mean, aside from the fact that the set underscore is considered an implementation detail of the compiler, I guess, well, you could go through the metadata, see the property, ask what the name of the setter that's associated with it is, and then write down its name. But going through the method set field certainly gives you better defense against somebody changed from an auto prop to a non-auto prop, but it'll depend on the amount of risk tolerance someone wants to take.
I mean, keep in mind this entire facility is in order to allow you to take advantage of someone else's implementation details.
Yeah, I mean, it's also just doing that fun thing, or exposing that fun thing where IL doesn't actually check access.
Right.
Because this is something anybody could have done if they were willing to just write the IL, and that's why the ref emit works. It's just like, whatever, load a field. I found one.
Yep.
Alright, can I get a grunt of approval from Emo, Steve, or Tanner? Just to show that people are actually listening. Let the minute show it was approved by grunt. Except they won't, because I won't write that down. Alright, and since there is no such thing as a 5-minute issue, I declare that we are close enough to our end time that we should just end the meeting 5 minutes early. So, with that, thanks everybody for joining us, and we will see you at our same .NET time on our same .NET channel, which should really be this Thursday. Hopefully we won't have to cancel another Thursday because of lack of quorum.
Do we potentially have a conflict Thursday morning? Also, the schedule is showing Thursday at 9 a.m. for some reason.
Yeah, there's a town hall scheduled till 10:30.
Yeah, so it's possible that Thursday might be delayed, maybe?
Fair enough. Hopefully Emo can get the public-facing calendar sorted out in all his copious free time. And, alright. Sounds like lunchtime to me, or for those of you not on West Coast U.S., other reasonable times of day. So,
Tea time.
Auf Wiedersehen.